Welcome to Shifting Ground, the podcast of the Orbis Journal of World Affairs, brought to you by the Foreign Policy Research Institute and the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at the Georgia Institute of Technology. Join us every other week as our editors connect the pages of Orbis with the issues of the day.
I'm Nick Vosdev, a professor at the Naval War College and senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute.
And I'm Larry Rubin, an associate professor at the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at the Georgia Institute of Technology.
Together, we serve as editors of Orbis, the Journal of World Affairs.
Each episode will speak with scholars, policymakers, and practitioners about the forces reshaping global politics, international security, and world affairs.
You can find this and future episodes of Shifting Ground on our website, orbisjournal.org, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all major streaming services. Please note that the views expressed by the hosts and participants in this episode are their own. This is Shifting Ground.
On this podcast, we step back from the headlines a bit to focus on the deeper forces shaping international politics, strategy, technology, and the changing global order. In case this discussion does go into a bit of current politics, we'll timestamp it for Friday, 1 o'clock, March 27th. But let's just get on to what's actually happening here. And I'll turn it over to Nick.
Well, very happy that we have Dan Byman with us, and he has contributed such a interesting and relevant piece to the first relaunched issue of Orbis that really comes at the heart of what we hope the journal will be focusing on, which is this intersection between a world in which technology grows by leaps and bounds and transforms the environment that we're in, coming up against a geopolitical environment that perhaps doesn't change as rapidly, and which presents its own challenges and its own risks. And Dan, of course, you've done a lot of work over the years on the intersection of changes in the global system, and particularly with regard to changes in the capacity of human beings to kill and disrupt each other, and linking that to the ability now for terror groups, non-state actors, criminal formations to be able to wield capacities which before we thought were safely in the hands of states. And so part of the discussion, we'd like you to be able to have this conversation with you, but really to get started for our listeners is to get us a sense of what got you into this field. Why did you come to focus on terrorism and national security, and how has that driven your interest in emerging technologies?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks. It's really a pleasure to be here with both of you. My career, because I'm ancient, really goes back to the 1990s. And I was working for the government at the time and doing work on the Middle East. And a lot of my work was not just on the kind of politics of Middle East states, but also on their use of violence, and especially the use of terrorism. And so it was what we call state-sponsored terrorism. And that broader question remained an interest of mine. In the 1990s, of course, we saw the development not just of state sponsorship, but especially of groups like Al-Qaeda, which when it was initially emerging, I have to confess, it was happening and I thought it was a relatively minor thing. And it wasn't for me until the 1998 embassy bombings where I was like, oh, this group is quite capable. It's very dangerous. And I had not given it the attention it deserved. Like many people who worked on Middle East security and terrorism at the time, I had other interests. I worked on U.S. intervention and kind of broader security studies issues in general. But then after the 9/11 attacks, the terrorism and related issues consumed U.S. policy attention. And I, along with other people who had been looking at this in the past, began to focus on it even more. After that, it's a relatively straightforward story where the different aspects of terrorism and why terrorists do what they do, different kinds of groups, all were things I've researched. And over time, I went beyond the Middle East and began to look not only at Europe and other parts of the world, but also at white supremacist violence in the United States. So I see this as a pretty broad area. and something that touches on lots of different aspects of politics and society and security in general.
Well, thanks so much. And one of the things I wanted to follow up with is kind of even going back to that time period. Do you remember a type of focus on technology in the way people understood either non-state groups or even state to state interactions?
There were a lot of focuses on, I'll say, terrorist tactics and methods. And with that comes technology. Are they simply using the technology of their time? Are they innovators? And the I think the best work was done by my colleague at Georgetown, Bruce Hoffman, who said, for the most part, they're operationally conservative. That in general, if you can kill someone with a gun, you don't need to invent some elaborate way to kill someone by some, special new technology because you have fairly tried and true means. And what he stressed was you should be looking at kind of limited forms of innovation where they're taking existing technologies and using them in new ways. Now, he didn't make a point prediction that they would take airplane hijacking and combine it with suicide bombing, as happened on 9/11. But that idea that you could look at different past tactics, synthesize them, and come up with possible future operations was something I think was very much the correct way to think about this. And what's, I'll say, very interesting and also scariest about terrorism is this question of innovation, where the vast majority of times terrorists are not particularly innovative. But when they are, it's really important because when they are, they can overcome defenses. They can otherwise act in ways that governments or those fighting terrorism don't anticipate and therefore do a lot more damage. So technology very much falls into that. And then this took on new urgency as social media spread. And terrorists began to embrace social media. The Islamic State proved excellent at it. I actually think the history of this kind of got some of it wrong, where a lot of it was people like me who were older saying, wow, they're using this crazy thing called social media. Boy, is it impressive. They must be geniuses, when in reality, it was just this is how younger people engage with each other. And they were doing what younger people were doing. But having said that, the Islamic State really did go deep on social media and used it very effectively for recruitment, for a lot of, I'll say, kind of internal morale building, and of course, at times to direct operations. And so the question, not just of how they use technology, but also how technology companies should respond, became to me a very important part of this overall discussion, to the point where I at least think of technology companies as very important actors in the broader counterterrorism infrastructure.
So Dan, and this maybe then will provide a lead in to the essay that you provided for us. But I'm listening to your description of kind of you're living through this era where these new technologies are coming in, and there's a sense either that well, this isn't the way terrorists have acted in the past, so why would we expect them? If a gun will kill you, why you don't need sharks with laser beams on their heads to do it when a gun is perfectly acceptable. But listening to this, there's a sense, right, that I'm getting that the market was producing all sorts of new technologies, whether it was social media, drones, the off-the-shelf capacity. Companies were coming online and saying, we can give you better satellite imagery of areas than you could get from a government. And this seemed to be a somewhat unregulated space for a while, in the sense that we didn't necessarily expect that these things could be weaponized. And as you're thinking about this today, what would be the core challenges that governments are going to face moving forward? Whereas governments wake up and say, as we've seen all throughout the Middle East, Russia, Ukraine, now in the United States itself, that relatively cheap, inexpensive, off-the-shelf drones combined with some degree of artificial intelligence, combined with some degree of commercial GPS applicability, can actually cause significant problems. Where do you see governments responding or catching up? And does that also beg the question, is the genie perhaps out of the bottle and it cannot be stuffed back in?
This is a huge challenge for governments. And some of the listeners may know the work of the scholar Audrey Kurth Cronin and her work on technology. And what she talks about, and it's a very sophisticated set of arguments, but one of her arguments is really, is the technology democratizing or not? So you have some technologies, nuclear weapons, where, one brilliant scientist by themselves cannot simply create a nuclear weapon in their backyard. right? Let alone, ordinary mortals. But on the other hand, something like the spread of dynamite and machine guns, right? That lots of individuals can take advantage of this and really change individual lethality. And she argues that social media technologies, and I suspect she would say artificial intelligence, are democratizing, right? They can go down to individual human beings who can take advantage of them outside of the direct control of government. Now, China has proven that governments actually can control these things at staggering cost. But it's, I don't want to make too absolute an argument. But for most people in most countries in the world, these technologies are largely outside the control of government. So one challenge for government is simply they don't own these technologies. And as a result, you'll have lots of individuals being creative and doing, lots of amazing things. But if you say, you know, 1 in 100 individuals is bad, right? That's, hundreds of millions of bad people, right? And as a result, you get, horrible uses of AI for child pornography. You get AI that is used to invent, drugs to addict people, right? So lots of very bad and dangerous uses. And in the national security space, of course, we worry about AI being used to design dangerous weapons to overcome important defenses. And in particular, at least in my view, the linkage between AI and biology, where it can create new pathogens. And again, you just need tiny numbers of individuals to have an interest in this, that you'll get real potential for damage. And so governments need to be able to influence not just people in general, but huge numbers, and also be able to deal with outliers, which is always very, very difficult. In addition, the technology is changing incredibly rapidly. One thing I noted in the Orbis article is, imagine a regulator said, hey, I want to be serious about this and work with Congress and develop regulation to deal with, the latest large language models by OpenAI or another company. If that individual did so, by the time you drafted legislation, showed it to stakeholders, had hearings, got feedback, you'd have new technologies out, right? The technology is just changing so incredibly rapidly. And so that's a tremendous challenge. And then, of course, the expertise is outside of government, right? That you don't look to the executive branch or the legislative branch for, a deep understanding of frontier AI. And I realize it's easy to kind of, make fun of, how some of the people in that really don't understand these technologies. But I wouldn't expect that, right? These are cutting edge technologies. The salary differentials are staggering if people are in the private sector. And so it's hard to get the expertise in government. So there are a lot of challenges, but these are some of the ones I'd highlight.
And it seems like you've outlined a lot of the core challenges the government has, not only just kind of all of the negative things that could happen with the application of some of these technologies, but and of course the implicit sense that there are actually a lot of benefits, is why the commercial companies are developing them. And I guess on that side too, you've also identified how it's different from the past, the speed at the technological change that can't really keep up with the regulations. One of the things that I was curious about, kind of if you can explain a little bit more, is how do you think democratic systems themselves are at a disadvantage in this environment?
Democratic systems have, strengths and weaknesses. One strength is that they are able to draw on the knowledge of all their citizens. And you'll get feedback, and that feedback can be exceptionally constructive, right? We have a long, horrible history of authoritarian systems making decisions that are actually disastrous for their own citizens, but in a way, not even knowing it, right? That they're making the decision. A few yes people say, hey, great decision. And anyone who opposes it gets arrested or silenced. And so these things go on and on. So democratic systems get that input and they can correct as a result. And those are real strengths. The disadvantage, of course, is that democratic systems are less able to operate very quickly. It's hard to kind of turn on a dime the way, Xi Jinping can make a decision and have Chinese authorities trying to implement it almost immediately. That's less likely to happen in a democratic system. And of course, democracies by design exert less control over the lives of their citizens. And that's a great thing, right? That's something we very much want. But it means that these technologies that every individual can use, the government is going to have less control over it by design. but that carries risks as well as benefits.
One of the things I also wanted to kind of follow up a little bit, you've touched on it somewhat, are what types of, or how should policymakers actually think about these trade-offs between innovation and economic competitiveness and security?
So honestly, I go back and forth on that in my own mind a lot, where, when I start reading on the security risks and thinking about it, I start to freak out. And I say, okay, we're going to have ungated AIs that are designing the next bioweapon and killing us all. And I'm genuinely concerned about those things. I don't want to be a doomsayer. And most of my work is usually in the opposite direction. But I do worry about the very dangerous potential here. And I do want government regulation. However, I look to the AI and cutting edge technology companies of Europe and then realize they don't exist, right? And that's in part because of the regulatory environment there. And I do believe these, technologies have tremendous potential for good, and we're already seeing that, right? Just as they could design dangerous, pathogens, they are already designing drugs that are saving many lives. They're improving efficiency and enabling tasks that were very onerous or difficult to be done with much greater speed, and as a result, freeing up humans for more productive activities. There's a range of things, and there's a lot of fun to it. And I use AI in my research, right? I want to be clear about that. And so there's, I think the potential is real, and I want these technologies to advance. But I do worry about the kind of catastrophic trade off. So I would like to see things go slower. But when you say that, that often means ceding the competitive advantage to other countries. And in this case in particular, my understanding of the latest large language models is that, Chinese models are not quite as good as the US, but they're not that far back. And if we broaden AI to be more than large language models, which we should, China's ahead in some areas. So I am reluctant to have one of the most important national security technologies be led by a potential adversary of the United States, and in any event, a country whose values and political system is one that I think is hostile to democratic values. So I do want the U.S. to be, a leading innovator. I want U.S. allies to be part of that innovation. So as you can tell, as I'm talking both sides of this question, I kind of haven't made up my own mind, because I think that tension is really important to understand. But again, what I think will happen is we will start to regulate this, but only after something really bad happens. And of course, that's not what anyone wants, but I think that's probably the political reality.
Well, just to perhaps pull the thread on that a bit more and maybe link it back to the potential changing character of terrorism itself, right? So, our stereotype view of the terrorist is someone in a ski mask with a gun, maybe hijacking an airplane or planting a bomb. But generally, the sense that this is still a physical, kinetic action. Someone has to go to a place, has to be willing to take risks. We've had in the past the image or the trope of the hacker who could unleash action and perhaps is not as physically fit or physically challenged or is prepared to physically even be present where the acts are taking place. Is there a sense that the very nature of terrorism in some ways is going to be reshaped by these new opportunities, that I don't actually need to be prepared to go out somewhere and potentially risk my own physical safety as long as I know how to manipulate the technologies, and I can do that from somewhere else and still have the types of effects that in the old days, quote unquote old days, would have to mean I'd actually have to go and shoot someone, plant an explosive device. So is there a sense that we may see a different breed of terrorists, so to speak, that the new technologies might enable?
So absolutely, and there are a couple possibilities I'd tease out here. So for those who followed the debate about terrorism and social media, what we saw when social media was spreading were large numbers of people who served as propagandists for a group like the Islamic State, but were not actually Islamic State members. And, people often talked about jihadist fanboys, right? So someone who just got excited about what the Islamic State was doing and took some existing Islamic State, footage where they showed their forces blowing up a tank in Syria or something like that. And they set it to music or they manipulated it in some way. But that was actually an extremely effective form of propaganda, because what it meant was you had lots of mini propaganda videos and so on that appealed to different markets. So it wasn't kind of one master narrative. It was lots of more individualized narratives that were compelling to different people. And artificial intelligence to me continues this. The other thing I would highlight is the risk of what the US government has been calling nihilistic violent extremism, which technically is not terrorism because there's almost by definition not a political motive when you talk about nihilism. But at the same time, just angry individuals who want to destroy. And it's the kind of school shooter who just wants to bring the building down, crashing along with their own death. But now that person can be doing that. Again, I worry about the convergence of AI and biotechnology, but that there may be a variety of means that empower individuals, mostly for good, but in a few cases, very dangerously for bad.
And now I want to turn to what's probably on everybody's minds. At least we're not sure where it's going to come, but I'm not gonna ask you to predict anything. Rather, thinking about the current conflict in the Middle East, and you can even think about the ongoing one, which many people have already forgotten in Ukraine, but certainly not the Europeans. How does, I guess, what you wrote and then thinking about the conflict, does it change anything of how you're thinking? Did it kind of prime, or what thoughts have you had just watching this conflict unfold?
We have seen the use of deepfakes fairly extensively already in the Israel US Iran war, where we've seen, footage of strikes on Tel Aviv or other parts of Israel that never happened. And we've seen others that show individuals mourning from Iranian attacks when the actual attacks didn't happen. And this has been a form of propaganda in part in Iran itself, where they're trying to send a message internally that, hey, we're striking back. Look at this footage. It's also a way of messing up the US and Israeli narratives, which is, this is a war where we are marching to victory and taking no harm. And one thing that's always difficult in any form of propaganda is judging how effective these things are, right? We all consume lots of stuff, and it's hard to know what really resonates and what doesn't. But to me, this is now entering the broader discourse, and it's a real challenge for governments because you have to respond in real time. Yet in real time, you often don't know how valid the information is, right? And I have no way out of that dilemma, right? To tell the government, you should wait 5 days so, forensic investigators can verify the digital footprints, right, is unrealistic. But at the same time, you don't want someone seeing, every video and responding instantly because some of them are going to be false. We saw a little bit of this early in the Ukraine war, and it's continued. But I think this kind of, false information being part of the broader wars is very likely to be something we see more and more of in the future. And to me, this is very important, as the Ukraine war has shown, because a lot of these wars are wars of resilience, right? Which is both Russia and Ukraine have, in my view, at least suffered staggering losses. And these are losses, human losses, these are economic losses. They've been doing this grinding war that has been, lasting almost as long now as World War One, right? It's right at that level. And nevertheless, they're still fighting. And the more you can try to undermine morale, the more likely you are to succeed. So to me, I see this as part of it. But then there's also this idea of empowered individuals who are kind of acting on their own. And we have seen kind of bottom up, if you will, terrorist attempts linked to the conflict where you've had angry individuals who have picked up guns. It is plausible to me angry individuals will pick up keyboards and that might happen more and more. And you could see that sort of thing, trying to be discreet where you're targeting a particular, military base or community, or also just to hell with the world. And I'm going to try to take as much of humanity down with me. Again, I'm always suspicious of doomsaying in terrorism, right? There's always a tendency to say, this attack happened. We're going to see a million more like it. We're all going to die. When a lot of the post 9/11 terrorism trends are actually very positive, right? The amount of jihadist terrorism in the United States, just to pick one example, has been far lower than many experts predicted after 9/11. And so I want to kind of balance my fears with some cautions, but I do worry about systems that allow all individuals to become much more powerful just because some of them are going to use this for bad reasons and in bad ways.
Well, this, I think, then comes into the recommendation part of our discussion, which is that, what if you had to give your elevator pitch to the president or to some other senior figures about trying to get ahead of these challenges, I mean, what would be the most critical element if they ignored or didn't listen to anything else, the one thing you would want to make sure that they walk away with when they're faced with this question of emerging challenges?
So I'll cheat and throw a couple things out there. And one is, at its most basic, we simply don't know what's going on, right? Which is these companies are developing these very powerful technologies, and they're not particularly transparent about it. Now, to be fair to the companies, they don't have to be, right? There's no law. They're not breaking the law. There's no one that is demanding this. But because these technologies have such profound effects on humanity, really, to me, it's very useful to know how the various frontier AI systems and frontier biology system, biotech systems are working, what internally they're finding for the negative side effects, and having that shared, right? And so one is that degree of transparency. The other is to build up expertise both in the executive and legislative branch. And that's a very difficult thing to do. It requires, paying experts and funding people and having some of the tech talent that is currently on the kind of private side be brought into government on a semi-regular basis. For those who are what political scientists call political economy fans, there's a real danger of technology companies actually using legislation to kind of stifle their competitors. So they, claim they're doing it for the greater good, but it's really putting in a bunch of requirements that make it hard to have free competition. So there are a lot of risks, but you need that expertise. And I would be thinking about this long-term question, which is recognizing that the systems themselves are going to change dramatically. Can you put certain parameters in saying, if you are working on technologies that have the potential to create highly lethal, contagious pathogens, then your reporting requirements go up. Then you have to have additional safety procedures. You'd want to bring in civil society organizations that are constantly testing these, right? I think even the best intentioned companies, and that's not always a high number, but even the best intentioned don't always test as rigorously as they can. And I would also say from your national security point of view, you want discussions between the United States and the Chinese on these. There's a understandable temptation to rush these systems into production because you're worried the adversary is going to get a leg up. And as a result, you'll have a lot of systems that are not fully tested, that are using relatively limited data, interacting with each other. And the potential for things to go sideways, in my view, is considerable. And you want dialogue on this. And I think the Chinese have the same interest we do in trying to make sure that competition doesn't lead to catastrophe.
You covered a lot of, actually, in terms of these recommendations, more questions, but I wanted to kind of throw it back one more time to see if you had any other big questions that you thought people should be asking that aren't being discussed. Anything else out there that just kind of makes you think people really are missing this?
So I think a lot of the focus, including in my remarks, has been on the AI side of things. I think the nanotechnology has not gotten the attention it deserves. And that is something, I'll be honest, I don't fully understand all the implications or even close to that. But when you are having nanotechnology combined with AI, you'll have a lot of things going on that are hidden to the human eye and yet have tremendous potential for change. And again, a lot of this can be quite good for humanity. I don't want to sell the benefits short. I think they're considerable. But I think sometimes we focus on the most visible parts of AI and not enough on some of the other very dramatic changes that are going on in the technology world.
Well, Dan, thanks so much for joining us today. Thanks to our listeners for tuning in, of course, to Shifting Ground, the Orbis podcast. We want you to be sure to follow the podcast and check it out on Spotify and iTunes and everything else like that. And until next time.
Thank you again for joining us, Dan, and thank you to our audience for tuning in.
It was really a pleasure.
This has been an episode of Shifting Ground, a podcast of the Orbis Journal of World Affairs. For more information about the articles mentioned in this episode, please visit us at orbisjournal.org. Until next time.